Well, would you look at that, my first video in literally 3 weeks, and it's not remotely what I normally do on this channel, but hey, it's something that I'm pretty passionate about, and I'm really excited to show it to you guys. I know this isn't Isles content, and don't worry, it's not going to replace Isles content, but the Monster Hunter games are something that I've always wanted to get into, but just didn't really have the financial stability to go into them. But with the advent of World, I was finally able to get my hands on this amazing game franchise, and I gotta be honest, I fell in love pretty much immediately. Everything from the weapons, the monsters, the armor, and even the kind of horrible acting, which is maybe only horrible if you have the English dub, but I don't know. But in all seriousness, with Iceborne right around the corner, and even Brachydios getting into this game on top of Nargacuga, I'm ecstatic to see what kind of monsters I get to fight next, and thought it'd be a good time to talk about the base game. Or kind of the base game. Now, if you guys want a full-length review, please leave something down in the comment section, but this is just going to go over the monsters, and I mean, of course it is. The monsters are what makes the series. I mean, it is called Monster Hunter, and there have been amazing monsters throughout the series, but unfortunately I've never just had the opportunity to fight them. But in World, I'm going to go over all the monsters in the game at some point or another, but in this video, I'm only going to go over my 10 favorites. Now, I should probably specify, even if it is kind of obvious, this is obviously going to be my opinion, and I know people hate hearing that in top 10s, but in Monster Hunter I feel like it's kind of more important than certain other series. Everyone has their own playstyle, weapons that they like, armaments, tools, some people like to buff, some people like to go in cold. It just kind of all comes down to playstyle, and that can really take the enjoyment out of a fight or add enjoyment into a fight, which will make everyone's top 10 really different. I personally really like using the hunter's bow. It was just kind of the first weapon I picked up and really kind of took off with. But I've also done an entire playthrough at this point, or almost an entire playthrough with the switch axe, and that's been an absolute blast because it's giving me an entire new playstyle to mess around with. The point being is that the monsters that I bring up on this list are fun to fight regardless of the weapon I have in my hands, and a fight that I look forward to kind of regardless of where I am in the game. Early, late, it doesn't matter. I enjoy fighting these monsters for what they are. Some of them are really challenging, some of them become pushovers, and some of them are just kind of fun to fight. Now, something I should bring up before we get into the rest of the video is the criteria for the creatures on this list. For the most part, it's my personal opinion on how I feel about the hunts, and I'm only going to kind of go into the gear. If their gear is really decent or really cool looking, I'll probably bring it up, but for the most part, I'm only going to show it off and not really talk about it as much. In games like this, where skill can be probably one of the biggest influencers, and you don't necessarily have to have the best gear because there's a good chance you can beat it even with kinda crap gear, I tend to kinda go away from being the best armored, geared, blah blah blah, and more or less just having fun with my appearance and picking something that I genuinely enjoy looking at. And while this has gotten me into some trouble in other games, but hey, Fashion Souls was the best Souls. Now right before number 10, I'm going to talk about the two honorable mentions of the monsters that almost made it onto this list, and that being Nergigante and Diablos, being the original Diablos. While I thought Black Diablos was a good fight, it just wouldn't have made my list. But the original Diablos is a great fight, and so is Nergigante. They just kind of barely scraped by on not being on this list. But they are honorable mentions, and I'd like to acknowledge them for what they were. A really hard decision to cut. So with all of that out of the way, and the anticipation probably killing you, let's get into my top 10 Monster Hunter World monsters. Now be you, walking around the early game. The craziest monster you've seen is the Anjanath, and even at that point you've never been able to really fight him, and then suddenly you get this googly-eyed freak coming in and out of nowhere. Number 10 is the Pukka Pukka. Now, the Pukka Pukka comes in at 10 at this list because, god, it is just such a fun early fight. It kinda does get a little easy later in the game, which is why it's only number 10, but the Pukka Pukka is one of my favorite fights just because it's so interesting. It's like a big wyvern chameleon, and I think that's exactly what they were going for. The Pukka Pukka is kind of like the first real gimmick monster that you fight in Monster Hunter World. Most monsters, for the most part, have some sort of element tied to them, and if they don't, then they're usually completely brute force. But Pukka Pukka is a really, really good way to practice for some of the monsters that do have elemental powers. Everything from fire to ice to even dragon blight. It's a really good way to test your skills to make sure that you'll dodge the really hard-hitting attacks. And overall, it's a very satisfying fight, especially since you can really easily tell the damage on the creature by by the fact that almost everything on it is breakable. Everything from its tail, to its head, to its wings. You can very quickly tell what type of damage you're doing based on what's breaking on it. The Pukka Pukka is such a well-made early game monster because there's such well-telegraphed attacks, on top of them working really well with the biology of the Pukka Pukka. Everything from the tail whip, to using its tongue like a giant whip, to suddenly spitting 3 things of poison at you all at different angles, so that if you dodge wrong you get hit. All of this really prepares you for the late game, or at very least the mid game, because every other animal for most part after that is going to be infused with some sort of element. The Odegard is the only real one that isn't, but everything else is either supersized to have nothing but brute force, or is infused with some sort of element or gimmick. Now admittedly, in later run-throughs, the Pukka Pukka is pretty easy to kill, and for the most part its gear is very subpar, and even the weapons that build out of it really aren't as good as the Ratheon versions. Still, it's a really fun fight, and has some pretty decent early game armor, and on top of that really helps prepare you for what's going to come, and make sure that you can remember telegraphs, and is kind of like a beginner's boss for the rest of the game. And on top of that, it looks so amazing. It's a beautifully feathered giant chameleon wyvern, and I don't know what else you really wanted from a herbivore that exists in the Monster Hunter universe. For me, this pretty much hits home, and I'm really glad that they put the Pukka Pukka in the game. It's quickly become one of my favorite pastimes to draw just because of those big googly eyes. So, as long as Pukka Pukka remains in Monster Hunter, I gotta say, I'm always gonna have a soft spot for this googly-eyed monster. Throughout all of what I would consider the early game, right before you finally attack Zora Magnaros for the very first time, you've seen a very particular creature, and you have wanted to get a piece of it ever since. And some of you maybe have, but most of you probably hadn't until the quest finally arrived. And at number 9, we finally have that monster in his stunning glory, and I gotta be honest, I think I'm gonna let his intro speak for himself. You are damn right those rocks didn't slow him down. Number 9 is the Anjanath, and oh my god do I adore this monster. For the most part, it's such a steroided, stereotypical version of what you'd think a giant T-Rex that spits fire would look like. They did a fantastic job on the designs, everything from the frills that pop out of its back and nose, to its massive fire breath attacks that can catch you completely off guard in the early game if you don't know what you're looking for with its tails. And it's because of this that the Anjanath is such a perfect early game boss. For most part, its big attacks are completely and utterly telegraphed. Everything from fire to ramming its head into the ground and charging you. But it's kind of like nudge you out of the way or smack you with the tail attacks are very hard to read unless you know exactly what you're looking for, which is perfect because it prepares you for the much rougher and tougher monsters that come later in the game. Not to mention that this thing is stupidly aggressive, and in the perfect way. It doesn't really give you much moments to breathe, but it tires itself out every once in a while, giving you just enough time to heal, or it helps make sure that you can lead into traps really quickly and really easily, because it's not really paying attention to them. It's just trying to murder you with its giant teeth. So it's because of this that I just adore the Anjanath, and I am so happy that it got put into the game. Its gear is decent for the early game, and its flame weapons are actually pretty good all the way up until the late game. And for the most part, I gotta be honest, I think that the male armor just kind of a little bit sucks compared to the female armor, but that's just a me thing. But for the most part, the Anjanath is one of my favorite monsters, and now that I've mastered its fight, I love going into it with low-level weapons and gear, just to test my skill against this amazing creature that roams the ancient forest. So for the most part in the early game, you've seen just about every monster you're going to fight beforehand. But then suddenly you get a quest to fight what is called a Toba Kodachi, which is number 8. And oh boy, is this monster one of the freakiest things you've ever seen. The Toba Kodachi is a mix between a flying squirrel, a cat, and some sort of snake mixed in with electricity. It is one of the coolest creations I think that's ever come out of the Monster Hunter franchise because it works really well. The idea behind it is that its fur creates static electricity, which is where it gets its electric attacks. And for the most part, it kind of makes sense, but it doesn't really rely on the electricity as much as you'd think. It's fast and absolutely one of the most aggressive monsters in the entire game, especially the early game. The Toba Kodachi has two very unique forms of attack. One where it'll climb up trees and use its flying squirrel-like webbing to, well, smack you with the tail, and the other where it will charge itself with electricity and then just get absolutely enraged and charge you with it. For the most part, the Toba Kodachi is one of the most aggressive monsters in the early game, and it works really well because it prepares you for the much worse fights to come. Its gear is actually pretty decent. While its armor is much to be desired, it does look kinda cool for the most part, but its weapons actually function all the way up into the late game, and in fact for some classes such as the bow, or I think for the most part even the greatsword, it's actually the better lightning variant compared to the Kirin version, or if you have a bow, it's the only version, for lightning element at least. So with that being said, even farming the Toba Kodachi actually has late game benefits, and for the most part, considering no one really likes fighting the Kirin, it's pretty much the only real option a lot of people have. And I gotta be honest, I think number 8 is a perfect place for the Toba Kodachi. It's a perfect early game monster that really helps you get used to the much quicker and agile monsters to come. And I'm always excited to fight something along the lines of this monster like Odegard or Toba Kodachi because, well, for the most part, it's just a really good fight. So number 8 is a perfect spot for it in my eyes, and I'm really glad that they added it to the game, because as far as I can tell, he's not hated by fans, but maybe not as loved as I think he should be. So, number 8 is the Toba Kodachi, in a well-deserved spot in my eyes, and I'm always excited to come fight this lightning monster whenever I feel bored. Coming in at number 7 is probably my first controversial pick, or I don't know, maybe not. How do you guys feel about the first 3 picks on my list? All I can say is that apparently for bow users, this is supposed to be a complete bane of my existence. And when I told someone that this was on my list, they audibly out loud said that they didn't believe me, and he plays Monster Hunter with me quite a bit. So I guess we're just gonna kinda let this one speak for itself. Coming in at number 7 is the master of the winds himself, Kushala Daora, and oh my gosh, is this one of my favorite fights in the entire game. And holy hot damn, is it probably one of the hardest. Kushala Daora is one of the most aggressive monsters for just how powerful it is in the entire game. Whereas other monsters have attacks that let you breathe, for the most part, this monster has no remorse, and a lot of its attacks linger in areas, meaning that it's normally not safe in the entire area around this giant dragon. But for the most part, his design is amazing. A giant, more or less steel dragon that flies around the sky controlling the wind. But with the simplistic design, they added a great twist, and with the steel frame, it turns a really regular dragon into a pretty terrifying menace, and on top of that, the wind doesn't make it a pushover either, making it a really scary fight if you're not prepared for it. His attacks are more or less really well telegraphed, but at the same time, the lingering effect is what a lot of people have issue with. On top of that, he actually creates a shield around himself that can actually blow people back in a way or block arrows altogether, which is why he's kind of the bane of a lot of hunter bows' existence. But for the most part, I've come up with a method that kind of gets rid of this, and you see it a lot in the gameplay behind you. Flash pods are really easy to get in late game once you're able to farm them, and he is so susceptible and weak to them that it's not even funny, and he kind of becomes a pushover once you get them. But if you don't have them, he's an amazing challenge, and probably one of the coolest fights in the entire game. His fight has such a grandiose spectacle to it, and his armor is probably one of the coolest sets in the entire game. While I personally have never been able to equip the female armor, I can say for a fact that the male armor is something that I actually am still working toward, considering I prioritized other armors before it. But the bow that Kusho Aura has is one of the coolest in the game, and probably one of the most unique designs I've ever seen. So for the most part, I can confirm that it's one of the coolest monsters in the game, especially for gear. Then again, that goes with all the Elder Dragons. But for me, this is a very happy number 7. Kusho Aura is one of my favorite monsters, and I love having to go out and hunt this giant dragon of steel. Now, number 6 is probably a monster that's either going to get me a lot of hate or a lot of people hopefully agreeing with me or even saying it should be higher on the list. But for me, it's the Basil Goose, or whatever you want to call him. The Mad Goose is definitely in at number 6. The Basil Goose is one of the craziest monsters ever. It's a walking, talking, well, screaming, flying bomb that drops smaller bombs. And it has one of the coolest armor designs I've ever seen in any game ever, on top of having a very unique and iconic roar already. It's one of my favorite monsters that I think I've ever really had the privilege of fighting in the game, just because of its looks alone. It carries such a weird aura about it. It looks almost too funny to be menacing, but at the same time, too menacing to be funny. It has this really cool in-between, whereas the Deviljho scares the shit out of you, for the most part. This looks so weird and so out of place, like a giant pine cone that's going to explode. But enough about its looks, let's talk about its gameplay, because it is one of the coolest fights ever. For the most part, it's actually really slow moving, and if you're smart, you can dodge it pretty fast and pretty easily. Even with really big weapons, it has such giant windups for attacks that as long as you keep yourself more or less out of danger of the big attacks, you can take a lot of the smaller ones and still be okay. The thing that is really scary about this monster is when it heads up into the air. Its dive bomb attack is legendary for one-shotting people, for good reason. It does massive damage. And on top of that, it attacks every monster around it. If you're hunting a completely separate monster on a completely separate mission, the Basil Goose will show up and blow up out of nowhere. It's like an ex-girlfriend that you can't get rid of. I really hope she doesn't find this. But honestly, its attacks are really slow moving, which is kind of weird, but they all carry an explosive trail behind them. And on top of that, it randomly leaves scales everywhere that will explode if you hit them on accident. His fight isn't exactly the most complex in the world, but he's such a cool design on top of having such easy to read mechanics that do punish you if you do something wrong. It's completely your fault if you die to the Basil Goose, and that's what makes it such an enjoyable fight for me. And I'll bring up some of its interactions later in the day, but I'm glad that it can go toe-to-toe with the Deviljho, and for the most part be somewhat unscathed. They go even, and that's all that matters to me. So for me, number 6 has to be the Basil Goose, and I gotta be honest, it's one of my favorite fights in the game. Oh, and before I leave, the gear is actually really awesome, but my favorite thing is the hook your cat up with the Basil Goose weapon. because it does explosive damage and will hit for about 100 damage once it gets exploding. So yeah, overall, I don't really have a lot of weapons that are made from the Basil Goose, but they're decent explosion weapons and probably the best explosion weapons in the game. At least until someone has something to say something about that, but hey, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But number 6 has to be the Basil Goose, and I'm so happy that they added this nomadic bomb wyvern to the game. Coming in at number 5 is a monster that I don't know if it's going to cause controversy or not. I highly doubt it, considering that she's kind of the poster girl for this game, right behind her other counterpart, and I gotta be honest that every game kind of needs a queen, so I'm going to let number 5, well, speak for herself. And with that, number 5 is the Ratheon, and I really do feel like that she has completely deserved this spot on the list, and for the most part has earned it. Rathalos and Ratheon especially are two of the most iconic monsters in any franchise ever, to the point where I knew about them before even getting into Monster Hunter. So, when it finally came time to fight these two, I had my expectations soaring high, and while Rathalos kind of let mine down with some of his spammy mechanics, the Ratheon became one of my favorite fights almost immediately. She has such a simplistic kit and a very small handful of moves that she utilizes really well. Are you far away? She's gonna shoot fire. Are you somewhat close? She's probably gonna whip you with her tail or sprint at you forward. Her simplistic kit is what makes her such a great fight because you actually know what's going to happen, but not so much that you're not gonna get off guard and probably hit with something crazy like poison or fire. Some monsters rely way too much on gimmicks rather than relying on what their strength should be as a monster, and it makes the fight really dull. Ratheon doesn't have those issues. The simplicity of her fight is what makes it really fun. She's an early game threat, but more or less drifts out once we get into the Pink Ratheon and Azul Rathalos stage. The Pink Ratheon isn't on this list. I'm really only talking about the base Ratheon. The Pink Ratheon is really good, but some of the moves kind of bug me and are sometimes poorly telegraphed. But the regular base Ratheon is one of the best monsters in the game to fight if you really need to practice for some of the harder ones. She's perfect. Her telegraphs are subtle, but obviously there, and it is easy to fight this monster because while she's not aggro, she's not passive. She's constantly giving you room to hit her and attack, but not pushing you to the point where you feel like you can't get a breath in otherwise. Her poison gear is actually pretty decent, and I think about the highest ranking poison gear you can get. I don't know how the Pukka Pukka stands up to it, but I'm fairly certain that the Pink Ratheon, for the most part, beats it out. So, on the right side, farming it in the late game will mean that you can eventually get the Pink Ratheon gear, and the Pink Ratheon gear for the most part is actually pretty good. The armor's okay, and definitely I wouldn't recommend it if you're going into late game, but it's a good mid-tier game item if you're going after stuff like the Anjanath or even Toba Kodachi. While it doesn't actually provide any real resistances toward them, you'll look cool and it won't get you killed immediately. So, in conclusion, even though Ratheon kind of does become a pushover later in the game, her simple kit is something that I really like because it's utilized almost to perfection in my eyes. And her gear is not bad, especially if you farm the base Ratheon, you're able to actually get the Pink Ratheon weapons later in the tier list, which is actually decent weapons and can actually help you in the late game. So overall, number 5 is Ratheon, and for me it is a completely deserved entry on this list. After all, she kinda is the queen. Now, my number 4 monster is a monster I have no idea whether or not it's going to be a good pick or a bad pick. More or less in the mid-game of the early game, pretty much before you hit actual high rank, there's this monster that you need to kill before getting to the Rotten Vale. And While I think the scream and everything is so iconic, I haven't heard much about this monster on any list, and I'm curious to see what you guys think about it. And I think I'll just let this monster talk for itself. And with that roar, you know exactly what it is. Number 4 is the Legaia, one of my favorite monsters I think ever to be shown in Monster Hunter, at least design-wise. I've actually heard so little about the Legaia that I'm almost kind of scared to put it this high up on a list, especially a list of this nature. But for me, the Legaia is kind of like the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. Its moves are so deliberate and so easy to tell that you know when it's going to do something and how it's going to do it. And the fact that its vocals have almost a rhythm that's really beautiful and choral to me, I actually really find it more like a dance than fighting, which is kind of weird considering most of the other monsters it's about patterns and tells and more strategic planning. With the Legaia, it's less of that, and I don't really know how to describe it. But let's get into the actual combat. The Legaia is aggressive, but its attacks are slower at first. Its lunging attacks on the ground and even its tail whip are a lot slower than a lot of other creatures you've probably faced up to that point. And for the most part, its tails are very obvious, but once it gets into the air, it's an entirely different beast. Spitting ice everywhere, zapping your stamina if you get hit by it so that you can't recover fast enough, the whole 9 yards. Legaia does not mess around. Being the apex of the Coral Highlands, you'd expect something kind of crazy, but not the giant banshee with ice. And yeah, it kind of does look like a banshee from Avatar now that I think about it. Well, kind of. Somewhat. I don't know. Someone pointed it out to me, now I can't unsee it. But the Legaia is such an interesting monster to me because of its design especially. Look at the wings, the way it moves. It looks so deliberately like a bird of prey that's evolved over massive amounts of time to me. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it just because I love the design of the Legaia, but it's one of my favorite in the game. And on top of that, its ice weapons are actually pretty close to the best in the entire game. In terms of raw damage, at least elemental type, especially with ice, I'm pretty sure Legaia has the best in every single category, all the way from the greatsword to the bow. And that's kind of an accomplishment. It owns an entire section of the weapon trees most of the time and is either the best or very close to the best ice weapon in the entire game. And on top of that, its gear looks cool as crap too, like you're some sort of glide suit that you can start flying with. And with that, you can even build a glide suit from it, or one that at least looks like it. So for me, the Legaia is always going to be one of the coolest creatures that I hold very dear to my heart, because it just has such a perfect design for what it is. And with number 4 out of the way, I feel like every controversial pick is gone, so it's smooth sailing from here. And number 3 is a monster that completely deserves this spot, and one that I basically adored from the minute I got this game. And while he doesn't really need an introduction, I'm going to give him one anyway. Number 3 is the Odegard, and holy hot damn, this one is pretty good. And even though I already said it, I'm going to say it again. The Odegard is coming in at number 3, and he completely deserves this spot. The Odegard is probably one of the biggest hype monsters that come out of Monster Hunter World, and for good reason. Everything from its gear to its fight is one of the coolest things you've ever seen, and I gotta be honest, its design is amazing. But first things first, let's talk about its fight, and its fight is amazing. The Odegard is one of the craziest monsters because it pushes the pace of the fight to the extreme. It barely gives you a chance to breathe, and while it doesn't actually have an element tied to it, it actually has bleed damage, and as you can see from the cutscene, it actually has 2 separate sets of claws, which is basically why they justify the massive amount of bleed damage that it can do. And hot damn does it work well. The Odegaron's fight is one of the most satisfying in the game, and it's kind of weird because most other monsters that are as aggressive as the Odegaron feel cheap or just not that fun, and they almost shoot themselves in the foot by being as aggressive as they are. But the Odegard is such an amazing fight because you don't feel like that's the case. You feel like it's completely fair even if you have spent the last 6 minutes running from it. And not to mention that its design is amazing. The Odegard's design is amazing. The red etched skin almost looks like that's actually armor, on top of it having this almost rattle in its tail. Not to mention the fact that when it screams, you see how giant its mouth and jaws are. Its claws, like I said, have 2 sets, one that's retractable and one that just isn't. Its design makes it look so much like an apex predator, and despite it not being the biggest thing in the Rotten Vale, it kicks the crap out of everything else that it comes into contact with. And that's pretty amazing. The only thing that has a really disappointing encounter with it is the Deviljho, because, well, it isn't really an encounter at all. And its bright red physique works really well in contrast to the kind of dark and damp Rotten Vale. It stands out like a sore thumb because no one's going to get in its way. Not to mention that it's one of the most aesthetically pleasing monsters that I feel like ever come to Monster Hunter. It's simplistic, it's like a panther on steroids, but it works. And its gear is so freaking cool. The Odegaron's armor is amazing. It is like the ninja gear from Monster Hunter World. It looks great regardless of the character you have, male or female, and for the most part, it's pretty much exactly what it should be. Some like lightweight looking armor that almost reminds you of being a shinobi. Its weapons, however, are just things that I've never really had much exposure to personally, but from what I can tell, they're decent fire weapons that probably can hold up all the way into the late game. But overall, the Odegaron's fight is amazing, and one that I look forward to regardless of where I am at in the game. In fact, fighting it with lower level weapons so the fight drags on is actually really adrenaline feeling, because you don't know if you're going to get killed or not. So, at number 3 is Odegard, and he completely deserves this spot for being one of the most badass monsters to ever grace Monster Hunter in my opinion. Do you like a challenge? Do you like being kicked the living crap out of by a monster who can throw around its weight faster than you could normally react? Good, because I have the perfect monster for you. This Nomadic Rex is one of my favorite monsters to ever come to the game. And I gotta be honest, after hearing about it in earlier entries, I was ecstatic when it finally got added to Monster Hunter World. Because the Deviljho is a monster you just don't with. The Deviljho is like an elder dragon that actually has decent reproductive systems because it is not rare in the slightest. This nomadic hunter literally shows up on every map, everywhere, and will kick the crap out of any apex predator that it gets its grubby little teeth on, and I love it. The Deviljho is one of the best fights in the game because it pushes the pace and makes you feel like you're taking down a larger-than-life beast that you have no real reason to be fighting. The Deviljho's fight is amazing because this thing feels like it's always enraged. It'll do everything from throw the ground at you regardless of what it is. Magma, rock, crystal, it doesn't matter. To spit dragon blight at you, to even slamming its head so hard into the ground at you with its mouth open that it gets stuck. Even its tail whips hurt like a truck hitting you. And it's perfect. You feel like you're taking on a behemoth of a monster, and that's exactly what you should feel like. This thing is a behemoth, and it works that to its advantage. The Deviljho's fight is actually pretty expertly paced, and while I have to admit I actually hated this monster when I first fought it because I was constantly getting one-shot, it's just a testament to how strong the monster is as a whole. Once you get better gear, it's actually not as bad as well. it first is when you have to fight it, and I gotta be honest, I did rage a lot when I first fought this monster, but once I actually got used to its patterns, the way it fights, and even the way it throws its weight around, I loved the fight, and it quickly became one of my favorite after I knew what I was doing, which is just a testament that maybe you should stick with fights that you hate, because if you don't understand them at first, you might like them later. But that's just me, because the Deviljho was completely worth it. Its fight has a very interesting pace to it because it actually tires itself out because of how aggressive it is. And like I said, this thing was worth waiting for because once I figured out how quickly it tires itself out in the later stages of a fight, it gives you a lot of chances to wail on it because it really does actually run at you with everything it has, just attempting to fit you in its mouth. And on top of its mouth, let's talk about the Deviljho's design because it looks badass. The first thing that comes to mind when I look at the Deviljho is the word hulking. It looks massive. It looks like a giant thing of muscle. And that's exactly what it should look like. The thing is basically just a mouth with legs. And it looks amazing because of it. The teeth on the outside of its mouth, on the inside of its mouth, all look devastating, but otherwise it's just a giant muscled up T-Rex on steroids. Not to mention that when it gets Dragon Blight finally going through it, after it becomes enraged, the red giant puffs that it gets look terrifying, and the monster immediately becomes something you feel like you should avoid, regardless of the gear or weapons you have. And that is amazing. And speaking of weapons and gear, the Deviljho's is pretty badass. The Deviljho's armor set looks amazing. It looks like someone decided to put teeth all over a piece of armor, and it works really well. Overall, it's decent armor that only gets really beaten out by the Elder Dragon sets later in the game, and that kind of does say a lot about the Deviljho if it's only beaten out by the Elder Dragons, the most powerful things in lore in the Monster Hunter universe. Its weapons, on the other hand, look badass regardless of where they are in any weapon tier. For the most part, I have to say my favorite is probably the Greatsword. It looks like it's a sword with teeth, and I cannot stress how amazing that is. But even the bow looks crazy unconventional, with using a chain as the actual pull string. Everything about the Deviljho's weapons and gear is amazing, and they're really good dragon weapons because they hit hard. And they should, because the Deviljho is an amazing monster. It has a well-paced fight that you have to be patient with, because if you get too greedy, he will punish you big time, and it really is your fault if you get completely wrecked at this monster in the later stages of the game. So with that being said, number 2 is the Deviljho, because it is an amazing fight, a fantastic monster, and one that I hope appears in every Monster Hunter game after this, because it is so good it's not even funny. And with that kind of introduction, do you need any more? Valhazaki is one of the most amazing looking monsters and one of the coolest premises that's ever come out of Monster Hunter in my opinion. And I do know about a lot of the old games and the monsters in them, but Valhazaki has such a unique and amazing aesthetic and design to him that I can't believe Capcom hasn't done something like it in the past. And Valhazaki coming in at number 1 should surprise nobody. I adore this monster, one of the greatest creations I've ever seen come out of Monster Hunter, and that is saying a lot. This monster is one of the most amazing designs I've ever been able to lay my eyes upon, and I adore him with all of my heart. He is such an amazing theme and such an amazing idea behind him, and I cannot stress how much I love this monster with both his fight design and everything about him. Its living dead theme and the fact that it formed a symbiotic relationship with the poison vapor that actually exists within the Rotten Vale is such an amazing premise, because it's an elder dragon not out of any sort of raw power physically, but out of the fact that it can manipulate basically the plague through its body without harming itself. And it's an amazing concept executed to what I think is basic perfection. And I cannot stress this enough that Valhazaki is a monster that I loved from the minute I fought it. And I had difficulties fighting it at first, but it didn't matter because I loved every minute I was in this fight. And speaking of fights, Valhazaki has one of the most unique fights I've ever come across in any genre or game ever. And I have to be honest, it's because of its mechanics and the way that it actually uses its physiology to its advantage. It's a very slender dragon in comparison to a lot of the other monsters in the game. So it's quick when it wants to be, and it's also deliberate when it wants to be. It'll do everything from drain the plague from the actual creatures around you into its own body to enrage itself. And what a unique and amazing concept that it uses to such perfection. If there are no creatures around, it'll just start absorbing the vapors from the rest of the Rotten Vale, and in such a way that you think it's completely natural for this creature to do that. And I love it for that. Its fight feels so unnatural, and it feels like it's part of the decay that has existed within the Rotten Vale, which makes complete sense why it would be there. It is basically an encapsulation of the complete rot that the Rotten Vale is, and it almost embodies that in its fight, and it feels amazing. Everything from swift and deliberate attacks to very large winds up with very powerful moves, basically shooting the plague in your direction. It's such a fantastic and amazing fight, and its pacing is something that should be talked about as well. And speaking of pacing, Valhazaki has one of the most expertly paced fights that I've ever had the pleasure of actually being able to participate in. It has such an interesting flow to it. It starts off slow and then gets fast, and then gets slower and then gets faster, completely showing off that its biology is what makes it do this. It has such a natural flow to the fight, and it doesn't feel sporadic in any way. Its movements toward the end can get kind of sporadic, but yeah, it's a giant monster basically fighting for its life. Of course it is. But it has one of the most unique designs behind it, and it feels so natural with its biology. The faster pace actually immediately comes after it and rages, which is very well telegraphed. And when it slows down, it's because you can visibly see it's been hurt, and it just feels so perfect in comparison to other monsters, which sometimes do it at random. Valhazaki feels just like it's supposed to, a monster that is doing everything in its power to basically poison and kill you. And Valhazaki's design is one of the greatest strong suits that the monster has. Its living dead theme of almost being zombified. Its flesh looks like it is literally hanging off of it, and its teeth look jagged and broken along with its claws. It has such a dead look to it that you almost don't believe this thing can be alive. But it's all almost an act because it's an elder dragon that you believe is the god of death and the Rotten Vale. Everything from the fact that it has no bottom actual part of its jaw, it's hollow, and having two separate sets of teeth make it look eel-like. It looks so amazing. Its wings even look torn, like they shouldn't be able to fly, even though they can. It looks like the embodiment of what the Rotten Vale is, and is the decay of the world above it, and it works to perfection. And its gear is freaking amazing. Valhazaki's armor is one of the coolest looking sets ever, almost like a glowing lantern of a head behind what looks like almost a decaying and torn apart body and armor. It looks fantastic and has a really neat ability of letting you regain health regardless of where your health is actually at. It's such a useful ability, that's why I never take it off. It's just so useful for saving healing items in occasions where I don't need to heal for that much. And its weapons are pretty amazing too. While none of them are standout and overly powerful, they're pretty decent dragon weapons, but look fantastic with the living dead thing being pushed all the way to them. and the greatsword looks freaking amazing. I just haven't gotten my hands on it yet. But my god, the weapons and gear of Valhazaki are completely worth getting and will help you in a lot of fights if you want to get them. Though I'd suggest getting the armor over a lot of the weapons because the armor is next level useful. And with that, I am going to conclude Valhazaki's section because I could pine on about this monster forever. I adore this monster, and I feel like that's pretty obvious with how I've described him. Everything about him, his weapons, his fight, his entire lore behind him. The fact that up until this point in Monster Hunter lore, we're the first to basically see and fight Valhazaki for the first time. He has such an amazing design, an amazing fight, and the gear is totally worth it. He is the encapsulation of what an amazing monster should be and what a fantastic elder dragon it is. Not a dragon of brute force, but a dragon that formed a symbiotic relationship with a virus. How amazing of a design is that? But number one is Valhazaki, and he not only earned it, but deserves this spot on my list in my opinion. An amazing monster for an amazing game. And that has been my top 10 Monster Hunter World monsters. So what do you guys think of my list? I actually kind of think it's going to be somewhat controversial, and I'm definitely going to get some hate for some of these picks. But you guys got to remember that I actually don't have any monsters in Monster Hunter World that I hate. And for the most part, I adore almost every monster. I have some standouts that I definitely don't like due to design choices, but I think for the most part, every monster in Monster Hunter World is pretty damn good. But hey, tell me what you guys think down in the comment section below. This has been the Jays of 77, thanks for watching, and as a quick side note before I end the video, none of the music is mine. It never is. I am not that talented to create this amazing music. Some of it's from Monster Hunter, and one of it's from an amazingly talented YouTube channel that I have links in the description below. Please go support the official releases as always. And I'll see you guys next time.